Deep within the wilderness, wrapped in a veil of night, stood a magnificent castle with sharp, towering spires from whose windows burst forth streams of dazzling light. Inside, the halls were alive with celebration. The atmosphere sparkled with joy while nobles and guests immersed themselves in merriment and laughter throughout the grand festivity. Every guest wore garments of splendid richness, their attire befitting the grandeur of the event. Long tables covered with opulent linens displayed a feast of delicacies, savory dishes, and wines in sparkling crystal glasses. Among the crowd, one particularly important guest approached with what seemed to be a warm smile, offering his formal greetings. He mentioned that this year the third son of the man he addressed had reached the age of 18, a moment of significance in their family. The guest continued, remarking that with 3 grown sons, life would surely become easier for their father. Yet, instead of joy, the man's expression showed little delight at those words. Abruptly, the guest noted that the youngest son had yet to awaken, and at last, the father's attention turned to him, clearly displeased by the remark. Was it truly possible that nothing had changed until now? The intrusive guest seemed torn between genuine curiosity and an attempt to provoke. The proud father, with a mocking tone, declared that his youngest son was better off remaining close to him, obedient to his will. The guest then observed that he had never once seen the boy present at any feasts celebrating his birthdays. Was the youngest son truly that withdrawn? The aging father considered that perhaps the guest was ridiculing his child for foolishness. Yet he calmly replied that his son, whose name was Bliss, had long suffered from fragile health. Suddenly, the heavy doors to the banquet hall burst open with a loud echo as someone stormed inside. It was a young man who rushed through the doorway, desperately calling out for his father's help while carrying a girl in his arms. The gathered nobles froze in confusion, their eyes immediately drawn to the source of this alarming interruption. The boy shouted for aid, his voice shaking with desperation, but no one stepped forward to act. His father grew visibly irritated by such behavior, thinking bitterly that his son was determined to become yet another subject of gossip among the ever-watchful aristocrats. The young man, ignoring his father's disapproval, came closer and revealed the name of the unconscious girl he held, Shauna. Bliss, his voice filled with dread and genuine concern, declared that the girl in his arms was no longer breathing. In a rush of panic, he explained that the Duke's household physician could do nothing to save her. His words tumbled out quickly, his tone unsteady as he begged for the family doctor of House Harris to be summoned instead. Yet his father, cold as ice and with visible disgust in his gaze, demanded to know who Shauna was. Bliss froze, his pupils tightening in shock at the words that had just left his father's mouth. A man standing nearby, clearly one of the Lord's retainers, stepped in to clarify. The girl, he explained, was Bliss's guide, mages hired to assist in awakening mana. Upon hearing her role, Bliss's father finally understood. His son had risked everything for this girl, a guide he regarded as nothing more than talentless and unworthy. The worthless son and his equally talentless guide were seen as failures, undeserving of attention. In a noble lineage of magicians, a child was expected to awaken before reaching the age of 10. Awakening was explained as the pivotal moment when an individual gained the ability to consciously summon mana. The earlier this awakening occurred, the greater mastery of magic the awakened would ultimately command. Bliss, being the youngest son, was supposed to achieve this milestone effortlessly at the age of 10. Yet, fate played cruelly, for even at 18 he had failed to awaken, leaving his future overshadowed by shame. Perhaps his progress was unbearably slow due to the poor abilities of the guide meant to aid him in this process. Bliss could have been assigned a skilled mentor with years of expertise, but his father, Duke Half, never allowed it. For as with a seed, no matter how much it is watered or how brightly the sun may shine, if it rots within the soil, it will never sprout. Bliss, the third son, tainted by impure blood running through his veins, was regarded as the sole disgrace of the family. Duke Half sighed heavily, wondering why his quiet, unnoticed son had suddenly caused such commotion, believing the boy's actions to be nothing but a waste. With chilling indifference, the Duke declared that if Shauna had died, she should simply be buried, and another guide would be found. Bliss, however, stood firm, refusing another. The boy tried to insist that the girl was not truly dead, she was merely not breathing, though her heart still beat. Yet his father silenced him abruptly, cutting his words short. The Duke questioned why his son would care so deeply for someone who had brought no benefit, scolding him for appearing at his elder brother's birthday with what he called a corpse. The accusation that Bliss hated his older brother and had sought to ruin the celebration pierced him deeply, leaving him in stunned despair. As the youngest tried to speak again, he was commanded into silence. The Duke continued, proclaiming that his son was too blind to see his own worthlessness, and that jealousy was his only trait. In House Half, there had never been such a pitiful child. Half carried on humiliating his son before the gathered nobles, reminding him that shame was no stranger to him. To the Duke, Bliss should at least repent before his brother, yet he declared that if Bliss truly understood the gravity of this moment, he would never have acted so disgracefully. Terrified and humiliated, Bliss lowered his head, his trembling voice preparing to utter an apology, until it broke and he fell silent. He wondered why he should apologize at all. If everyone ignored him, why should he abase himself with meaningless words of regret? The feast that day was held in honor of Michael's birthday, yet also in recognition of Bliss. However, Bliss himself was forbidden from joining the festivities. Anger and sorrow burned within him, for he had never once been allowed to share in the joy of celebration. Endless suffering, quiet endurance, humiliation, and shame, these were the pillars of his existence. And so, if all those emotions were stripped away, what would truly remain of Bliss's consciousness? Yet the only thing he truly knew, the only desire that still burned in him, was for Shauna to live. For that single chance, he was willing to once more play the role of the family's worthless son. Bliss bowed low, offering apologies for what was called his reckless act. He insisted he had no intention of ruining the banquet out of envy for his brother. All he had wanted was help, for the condition of his guide had grown perilously grave. Holding the unconscious girl tighter in his arms, the boy vowed he would trouble his father no further, begging only this once for mercy and assistance. The youngest declared that if Shauna survived, he would accept any punishment without complaint, yet the Duke refused to hear a single word of it. The Duke shouted back that his son had dared demand the family doctor of House Harris. Did the boy truly believe such a request to be so simple? Then came the merciless command. To his retainers, he ordered that the girl's body be taken away immediately and burned upon a pyre. Bliss trembled in terror at the cruelty of that decree. As two men moved quickly to carry out the order, Bliss threw himself against them, desperate to stop what they intended. How could they do such a thing when her heart still beat within her chest? His voice rose from trembling to a desperate shout as he cried out that Shauna was still alive. Then, against his will, Bliss saw the hand of one servant stretch toward Shauna's body. His breath caught, his body tensed, and in the air there lingered a chilling sense of danger. Suddenly, he roared for them not to touch her, and in that instant, radiant beams with a bluish shimmer burst forth around him, stunning all who bore witness. The dazzling light rolled across the hall, shaking objects from their places and blinding every eye, leaving none able to grasp what was truly happening. The entire chamber became cloaked in white brilliance, laced with a freezing blue aura. Panic erupted as nobles screamed and fled in every direction, each seeking safety from the chaos. Duke Half stood rooted in place, his gaze fixed on the madness unfolding, the thought rising within him. Was this the long-awaited awakening? Ice began spreading across every surface, the banquet hall plunging into bitter cold as the shining beams howled like a raging snowstorm. Table linens froze stiff, windows glittered with frost, and every fresh flower in the vases stiffened into lifeless sculptures, dusted with snow. The Duke recognized the truth at once. This was ice magic. Bliss had awakened at last, far too late in years, but still wielding power vast enough to command ice on such a tremendous scale. Yet if it continued unchecked, the entire banquet hall would be entombed in ice. The Duke knew action was needed swiftly. His son had to be stopped. With a voice as calm and cold as the ice engulfing the hall, Bliss asked if he was supposed to stop. The youngest son fixed his father with a desperate, almost crazed stare, confessing that he did not know how to stop, for his guide no longer breathed. Bliss declared that no one else could help him now, while the chamber continued to freeze around him, the glacial force destroying everything caught in its path. The crowd shrieked in terror, panic spreading like frost itself as walls, floors, and pillars vanished beneath thick layers of ice and snow. Guests scattered in every direction, attempting to escape the madness, yet like everything else, the doors were most likely sealed shut by frost. Duke half realized with a chilling certainty that this was no ordinary awakening. It was an overflow. In such abnormal awakenings, a torrent of emotions surged unchecked, shattering a person's self-control. Mana erupted without restraint, plunging its host into overflow. Without a guide, without intervention from outside, the flood could not be restrained. Just as Bliss had said, no one could stop it alone. Understanding that his son was powerless to halt it himself, Bliss only clutched the unconscious girl tighter, though her body was already growing cold from the very power spilling out of him. His gaze, wild and trembling under the weight of overwhelming emotion, fixed upon her as he called out her name, hoping she would awaken. Speaking her name once more, Bliss embraced Shauna tenderly yet desperately, pressing her against his chest. At that very instant, the girl, who only moments earlier had seemed lifeless, cursed silently in her mind, realizing the dire situation into which she had been drawn. She wondered why the awakening had come now and by what means she was supposed to resolve this disaster. Shauna admitted to herself that she had failed miserably, though she could not understand how it had come to this. Her plan had been flawless, and she never imagined being struck down so unexpectedly by Bliss himself. She could not believe it, nor could she grasp why his awakening had been triggered by her apparent death. Then, within her thoughts, came the memory of a small boy who had once spoken to her, declaring that from that moment onward she would be his guide, the one destined to lead him. The boy with pale skin, dark hair, and bright blue eyes wore a black shirt with a red ribbon tied neatly at the collar, a vest of deep grape color, and lighter trousers. He introduced himself solemnly as Bliss Half. The girl, after listening to him, felt both uneasy and nervous, yet in that moment she finally understood her role. She gave her name, saying she was Shauna, and that it was a pleasure to meet the young master. Though Shauna was not truly pleased with this arrangement, she knew that in the end she had no choice but to accept it. Bliss himself could not decide whether he should feel relief or sorrow that his so-called useless guide had died during a monster hunt. In truth, the incompetent guide, fated to perish in the earliest pages of this story, was none other than Shauna. Awakening after her death, the girl opened her eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling, though deep down she already knew what had happened to her. Once upon a time, she had been nothing more than an ordinary woman, living a simple life like anyone else, though she had also been a devoted reader. She read only romance novels aimed at adults, especially those marked with the tag hashtag hardcore. And given who she was, from the very first second she should have realized exactly whose body her soul had entered. The girl now had long, curly hair, the color of pink cotton candy, soft and shining like spun sugar. Her eyes were large, a warm amber shade as if mixed with honey, and her face carried the gentle, delicate features of a young maiden. When the maids entered her room, they addressed her as Shauna. Yet the girl inhabiting this new body had no idea what to do. This so-called Shauna was frightened, unable to comprehend how such a thing had happened, nor what she should do next. She searched desperately through her memories, trying to recall a character with this appearance and name, yet nothing surfaced in her mind. The heroine considered that perhaps the girl whose body she now occupied had been killed by some cruel woman. Or maybe she had been cast out of her home once her family discovered the truth, that she was only adopted. The girl understood all too well that if she had landed inside the pages of one of the novels she once read, the future ahead of her would hardly be bright. In such stories, every man was usually portrayed as a dangerous lunatic. The heroine reasoned that no matter which character she had possessed, that person would inevitably be tied to the male lead. And if that connection was real, then he would treat her the very same way he treated the main heroine of the novel, would he not? Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted when a woman entered the room. The heroine turned her attention toward her as the woman addressed her by the name Shauna. It was a maid from the wing who introduced herself as Anne. With a bow, she requested permission to escort the heroine to the third young master. The girl was then led to a small manor which was in a state of neglect. The entire building was covered in ivy, while the plants around it were withered and lifeless. The brick walls were riddled with cracks and gaps through which stubborn vines forced their way across the stone. The grass was dry, and the few flowers that still remained looked long abandoned, drained of life. Seeing the condition of this house, Shauna felt both startled and uneasy, unable to grasp what kind of place this was supposed to be. The maid explained that this wing was where the third young master's training would take place. She also added that, soon enough, Shauna's belongings would be moved here. Shauna grew cautious. Training in a place like this? Secret training for the male lead? The entire situation struck her as suspicious, yet she followed when the maid asked her to come along. And so the story circled back to the beginning, where the main hero declared the girl his guide, and, in some sense, his mentor. The boy calmly and coldly introduced himself as Bliss Half, his icy blue eyes seeming to pierce straight into her soul. Shauna carefully studied the appearance of the figure before her, growing uneasy as she realized exactly where she had ended up. She noticed his black hair, as dark as night itself, gleaming faintly under the light of the room. She also saw his bright blue eyes carrying a glacial tint, as if they could see straight through everything. At last, the heroine understood where she was and with whom. In that instant, she realized that the boy standing before her was strikingly similar to Bliss from the tale of Blue Flame, Red Flame. Bliss, born into a family of magicians, had long endured endless humiliation and disrespect at the hands of those closest to him. This was especially true after the dreadful incident that had marked his life, the loss of his incompetent guide. Now Bliss encountered a new guide in the form of the heroine and successfully awakened, unlocking the latent power within him. Shauna finally realized that she herself was the incompetent guide who had been entrusted to him. The girl reflected on the cruel irony. In the story, her character had died at the very beginning, which explained why she had struggled so much to recall the original heroine. Her thoughts were abruptly interrupted when Bliss asked her to begin guiding him. She was taken aback by the request. The young master reminded her that she was his guide. Did she not know how to properly direct him? Yet, in truth, the girl had no concept of what guiding even meant. In the context of the novel, guiding was something the heroine never had the opportunity, or even the responsibility, to do. Originally, Bliss had used the guise of guidance to force the heroine into actions far beyond what an ordinary guide would undertake. But now, both were merely teenagers, and attempting to replicate the events of the novel would be difficult. Above all, the girl had no idea how to guide him. She suggested that since it was only the first day, perhaps they could start by getting to know each other. Understanding who Bliss was as a person, she reasoned, might improve the effectiveness of their training. The young master asked if she wished to learn more about him. She agreed, thinking that one should not treat kindly someone who treated them well. Suddenly, Bliss fixed her with his fully icy, piercing gaze, as if seeing straight through her, and with the same cold voice, declared that her words were false. Shauna forced a smile, quietly wishing that Bliss could smile too. It would have been so much better. The young master sighed, acknowledging that even now he had known that her guidance would not proceed properly. He observed that the guides his father had hired were not the sort from whom one could expect much. He had never imagined that his own guide would turn out to be so young. As far as Bliss knew, his guide was only 15 years old, meaning she had only just received her Magicians Association certificate. His elder brothers had been assigned guides with years of experience, while he had been given a mere girl, who, moreover, was 3 years older than him. Shauna realized that if Bliss was currently 12, she had roughly 8 years left in her own youth. Bliss admitted that his father had no expectations of him. Truthfully, he himself would have expected nothing from a son in his position. Shauna frowned at his response, growing wary. She listened carefully, but what she heard left her unsettled. Bliss was the illegitimate son of Duke Haff. His father had believed that precious blood ran through him, and so, guided by intuition, had left him be. Yet the Duke's intuition had failed him. It seemed the boy had no natural aptitude for magic. As a result, his father began to treat him as a discarded child of lower status. Unable to restrain his desires, the Duke had betrayed his young servant, fueling a deep-seated resentment toward the innocent Bliss. Bliss turned away from the girl, refusing even to look at her, and told her she could leave. He explained that she would be of no use to him in any case, so there was no reason to pretend to be his guide. Shauna thought it remarkable that he would reject her so quickly. She knew he would eventually yield before meeting the heroine, but to do so at the age of 12? Feeling sympathy for the boy, Shauna quietly stepped closer, keeping near him as he began to move away. The heroine grabbed and squeezed Bliss's hand, stopping him from leaving. Bliss was startled and spun around sharply, staring in surprise at the girl who had taken his hand, something he had not expected. Suddenly, Shauna noticed that the boy's body temperature was unlike that of ordinary children. She was taken aback by how cold his hand felt. Bliss tried to push her away, insisting that she could offer him no help. Shauna, however, encouraged the young master not to give up. To craft a large vessel required more strength and time than creating a small one, she thought, and the same principle applied here. She explained that this meant Bliss's awakening would take slightly longer than others, but the results of his bloom would be extraordinary, incomparable to anyone else. Bliss, skeptical of her words, asked without any real interest how she could possibly know such a thing. The young master stepped slightly away from the girl, who, in response, gripped his hand firmly with both of hers. Still refusing to let him pull away, Shauna smiled at him sweetly, a smile that seemed genuine despite everything. She told him that she sincerely believed in him, though her confidence came mostly from having read the story before. The heroine urged the young master not to doubt himself or his abilities, insisting that belief in one's own strength was essential. To help guide Bliss more effectively, Shauna began living in his wing. Lying on a soft bed surrounded by books, she reflected that, as his guide, her role now was to nurture and instruct this not yet awakened child. Viewed more broadly, this responsibility resembled that of a nanny or a private tutor. Typically, guides were magicians from humble families. The more experienced such a magician, the more valuable they became. The older the guide, the more capable they were. Occasionally, families hired young guides to provide natural guidance in a calm environment. Yet Duke Haff had not employed Shauna to peacefully and quietly conduct his son's guidance. The elder Haff had been Bliss's first guide and had attempted to awaken his magic personally. Yet Bliss had achieved nothing, even by the age of 10. Unable to succeed or replicate his previous efforts, Duke Haff had simply given up and abandoned any further attempts. Shauna considered that, although the Duke had assigned her to Bliss, it was more from fear of social criticism than genuine concern. It was obvious to all that this had been done to save money. Thus, she, the heroine, had been appointed, despite her current inability to guide him. Yet Shauna thought to herself, she had no idea how to channel mana into Bliss, nor how the process was even supposed to unfold. The heroine discovered in the book she had been reading some information that had previously eluded her. The first stage explained that the guide channels their mana through the tip of a finger, while the student's mana responds to it. Consequently, a light physical touch was inevitable, the heroine thought as she continued to read. She recalled that, as far as she remembered, the two main characters had spent a considerable amount of time together. Yet, even this proximity would not be enough to generate mana. After studying the passage, Shauna tried to concentrate on the mana flowing within her own body. She focused on channeling the energy toward the tips of her fingers, attempting to gather it in her hand. The girl tried to replicate what the book described, but because she had no true understanding of the process, nothing worked. She thought that any moment now something would happen, and she would succeed. Shauna opened her eyes, anticipating a result, but all she saw was her hand, exactly as it had been before. No magic, no unusual phenomena. The heroine's attempt failed completely. Overcome with frustration, she collapsed onto the pillow and pounded it with her fists, reminding herself that today she had to complete her meditation. In the next moment, the young master was seated on a chair opposite Shauna. Shauna instructed him to close his eyes and feel the mana flowing within Bliss's body. He remarked that no one had ever asked him to do this during his guidance before, but the heroine interrupted him, silencing his objection. She pointed at Half and ordered him to focus, insisting that this was a test of his willpower. Bliss seemed confused by the concept and wanted to ask what she meant by test, but he decided not to question her and complied, ready to follow her directions. Once again, the scene returned to the bedroom, where Shauna lay on the bed, desperately clutching a pillow. She admitted to herself that she had been delaying the discovery of the correct guidance method, yet Bliss meditated every day, leaving her conscience tormented. She knew he could not spend the next 8 years meditating alone. Naturally, she contemplated how she might escape her role as guide. However, there was a small obstacle. The contract they had signed with the Half family was lifelong. Shauna could only leave the Half family under 2 conditions. Either Bliss successfully awakened his magical powers, or she tragically died as a result of an accident. She wondered where such an unbreakable contract had even originated, unable to fathom its strict and binding terms. The heroine understood that lifelong contracts were common. Rarely did an awakening fail, and a guide would rarely be left without work if unwilling. But for her personally, the contract still felt dreadful. The current Shauna felt angered by the thought of why she hadn't immediately swapped places with the original heroine, who was doomed not to survive. To resolve the problem, Shauna considered several strategies: pretending to be dead to annul the contract, finding the original heroine to take Bliss with her, or simply giving up and enduring the ordeal passively until the end. Yet she decided she did not want to remain with Bliss for long. It was difficult to deny that the young master was an attractive and compelling figure. Yet according to the story, he was far too attached and devoted to the original heroine. In his otherwise unfortunate life, a beacon of light had appeared, a beautiful savior in the form of the original heroine. But to ensure she could never leave him, Bliss had inscribed a magical seal, allowing him to always know her location. Understanding that she would never truly escape him, the heroine resigned herself and shut her heart away forever. By the story's conclusion, Bliss was content to possess only the shell of the original heroine, with not a single trace of her consciousness remaining. Shauna admitted that even thinking about this exhausted her. Sitting on the bed, she continued to clutch the pillow tightly in her hands. If Bliss were to encounter the original heroine later, he would retain the same personality he had in the story. Shauna did not know whether she would be safe remaining close to the young master, so she resolved to distance herself as much as possible. Releasing the dark thoughts that had plagued her and replacing them with lighter, happier ones, Shauna smiled to herself. Suddenly, the books lying on the bed began to rise, levitating, surrounded by a warm, luminous glow. The heroine promised herself that, regardless of the story, she would enjoy a happy life as a sorceress. She understood that even if she could not channel mana into Bliss, she still possessed enough magic to manifest her own power. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door of her bedroom, jolting Shauna from her reverie and pulling her back to full awareness. As the door opened and one of the maids stepped inside, Shauna thought to herself, could it really be time for lessons already? The maid addressed Shauna respectfully, calling her "Lady," just as Shauna was beginning to rise from the bed. Shauna noticed the expression on the maid's face. In this wing, the faces of the servants always seemed lifeless, but today the maid looked even worse than usual. The maid informed her that the young master did not wish to hold lessons today. Shauna listened carefully as the maid continued, explaining that Lady Shauna could rest for the day. Shauna suspected that the child, so keen on the awakening, had suddenly decided to cancel lessons because Bliss had realized the futility of the meditations. She asked if she could learn the reason for this sudden change. The maid replied that today the young master had been chosen as the keeper. However, the keeper's state was rather unusual, and in the maid's opinion, Bliss appeared to be deeply flustered. Shauna sighed, realizing that it was not confusion that had struck Bliss, but likely disappointment or sorrow. The girl rose from the bed and announced that she intended to go to the young master. Barely giving her a moment, the maid reminded her that Bliss had said he did not wish to proceed with the mentorship, to which Shauna responded that she was not going to him for that reason. She hurried, almost running down the long corridor, thinking that there were no decent adults in this house. No matter the relationship between the master and his servants, if a child suffers, an adult should offer comfort. Instead, everyone simply acted indifferent, as if it were none of their concern. Yet neglect itself was a sin. This was especially true for children like Bliss. Approaching the young master's door, Shauna knocked firmly with her fist. After knocking, she called out to Bliss, letting him know that it was Shauna who had come. Receiving no response, Shauna pressed her ear against the door and called the young master's name once more. She listened carefully and heard a weak, quiet, and trembling voice coming from behind the door. The boy's voice was so faint that Shauna had to strain to hear him. He said he did not want to practice guidance today. She thought that in the future, this young master, driven by his obsessive nature, would cry alone like this. Bliss sat in the dark of his room, wrapped in a blanket. Shauna reassured him that she had not come for guidance. Hot tears ran down his cheeks as he hid from the world under the warm cover, asking why his guide had come. It was not entirely the truth, but Shauna smiled and said she had come simply because she had missed him. Standing before the door with a silly smile, she still heard no reply from behind it. Shauna wondered if the young master's worry about the keeper was the cause and questioned whether teasing him was too tactless. She admitted she had only joked and asked if they could talk. She intended to speak about the keeper, but hearing a noise, she raised her eyes mid-sentence. The door opened, revealing the young master, his face sad, his eyes red from tears. Instead, he became angry, believing that his guide was mocking him. Bliss said he felt that in Shauna's eyes, he appeared ridiculous, as if she were treating him like a child. Shauna found this odd. How could she not treat him as a child when he was only 12? She explained that she had only been concerned about the young master, yet he refused to believe her. Shauna told him that since he had suddenly canceled guidance, she had been worried. Bliss interrupted her, insisting that he was not a pitiful person whom someone like Shauna needed to worry over. This irritated Shauna, and she thought to herself, could the young master really be trying to undermine her self-esteem? Still, she reassured herself that he simply could not recognize kindness, a trait unsurprising given the harsh environment of his upbringing. Yet she was completely different from those who had previously surrounded Bliss. She smiled again and insisted that her concern was genuine. Shauna expressed how saddened she felt for the young master. In response, he tensed, seemingly even angered by her words. The heroine gave an example, prompting Bliss to consider the reverse scenario. What if she suddenly refused to continue as his guide and stopped seeing him? The young master replied that she could not do that, as it was her duty. Slightly irritated, she countered that she could, if she were careless in her duties. Wouldn't the young master then worry about her? Bliss, however, could not comprehend why he should care at all. Shauna realized that the young master showed absolutely no personal interest in her. She had not expected such detachment from someone so obsessively driven, yet she still had several years of work ahead with him. Truthfully, Shauna in this story was nothing more than an inconspicuous tertiary character. Even before entering this world, the girl had already experienced such a pitiful existence. For instance, in her past life, she had been a nobody, so would she remain similarly insignificant in this world as well? Her gloomy thoughts were interrupted by the young master's words. He sighed, as if agreeing, or perhaps indifferent, and asked her to stop. Shauna, surprised, repeated her question, as though she had not heard him. Bliss, understanding her meaning, firmly told her to cease. Shauna grew anxious, wondering if this meant the young master no longer wanted to see her. How could he say such a thing? Should she retreat? Bliss sighed wearily, closed his eyes, and finally invited her into his room. The two entered a spacious, bright room decorated in golden hues. Inside were a large, comfortable bed, nightstands, a desk with 2 small sofas, and a basket sitting atop the table. Bliss explained that he had canceled today's guidance only because other matters demanded his attention. He needed to investigate the keeper who had chosen him. Understanding the situation, Shauna was surprised and congratulated the young master on the news. She then asked. She sat beside the young master on a small sofa, smiling warmly, while Bliss, for some reason, turned his gaze away from both her and the basket on the table. Shauna gazed at the basket before her, focusing intently on its contents. Her amber eyes carefully examined every detail. The living creature inside, born by absorbing the mana stored in plants and animals, was the keeper. The keeper chooses its wizard, the one it will serve faithfully for life. However, if its chosen master dies, the creature releases its final breath and returns to nature. Thus, being chosen and trusted by a keeper is an immense honor for any magician. In the novel, Bliss had been incredibly fortunate at a relatively young age to be chosen. He received the first keeper, one that his brothers could not claim. Even though Bliss had not yet awakened, his potential as a magician was limitless. Yet, the disappointment had to be as immense as the joy. Shauna looked into the basket, noticing a soft white blanket upon which lay a small creature, a dark, fluffy ball with a tiny, thin tail. At first glance, she thought it a rather unimpressive beast. No wonder Duke Huff now despised Bliss even more, claiming he had ruined his reputation while his own brothers mocked him. But Shauna knew the truth from the novel. That small tuft of fur was nothing less than a snow-white dragon. Majestic and proud, its body gleamed white like fresh snow, with eyes resembling black pearls and scales that shimmered with an opal-like brilliance. This dragon was famous for its beauty, yet equally for its cruelty and merciless nature. Furthermore, it had long remained unseen as a keeper, existing almost like a legend. A dragon of this kind appears once every few centuries and had chosen Bliss as its master. Undoubtedly, the author intended to crown Bliss as the most powerful in the world. Shauna thought that if Bliss knew this, he wouldn't be so sad. She turned to the young master and smiled. Trying to speak sincerely, she commented that Bliss's keeper looked both charming and powerful. Bliss froze and glared irritably at Shauna. Apparently, he did not appreciate her honest remark. He warned her not to lie, but Shauna assured him she was telling the truth. She opened her mouth to add something, perhaps to present another perspective, when suddenly she heard a strange voice inside her mind calling her as a young magician. Shauna was startled, glancing around in confusion, unsure where the voice came from, or if she had even heard it at all. The unknown voice repeated its call. Did the young sorceress hear him? Shauna grew anxious and tried to discern its source. She turned to the young master, asking if he happened to hear anything, but Bliss replied that he didn't understand what she meant. Before she could explain that she had heard a voice, he added that his master didn't hear anything. Hearing this, Shauna realized it would be best not to mention it to Bliss. When he asked what she was talking about, she shook her head and said it was nothing. Frowning, she cautiously glanced toward the small creature in the basket on the table, a suspicion creeping into her mind that perhaps it was the source. The keeper noticed her secretive gaze and waved its tiny paw, its small black eyes like pearls, fixed on Shauna. Panic gripped Shauna. She could hardly believe it. Could the young master's keeper really be speaking to her? The creature then began to speak, suggesting that she might be curious why it was talking. It had a story it wanted to share, but only with the guide. The fluffy ball asked to be taken somewhere away from its master. The keeper needed to be alone with Shauna immediately, yet she had no idea what was happening. Until the keeper fully matured, it would normally remain silent. In the novel, nothing indicated that the keeper would hold private conversations with Bliss's incompetent guide. Shauna considered pretending as if nothing had happened. The creature wagged its tail and asked if she was indeed pretending not to hear. Perhaps it should take action to make her listen. Suddenly, it said something serious. The matter it wished to discuss was extremely important, concerning the life or death of its master. Bliss noticed his keeper's unusually active behavior and asked why it was making such a fuss. Just a moment ago, it had been calm. Shauna reached for the keeper and stroked its fur, guessing that it felt uncomfortable, its body cold. She asked the young master to immerse the keeper in warm water. Bliss frowned and asked if there was a risk it might drown.
Shauna assured him it wouldn't happen, as she would watch over it. Yet Bliss knew such tasks were usually handled by servants. Shauna was his guide, not a maid. While she herself wasn't eager to perform servant duties, the young master's keeper wanted to remain alone with her, and this was truly a matter of life and death. Shauna assured him that it would be better if she handled it. Ordinary people often struggle with keepers. She added that next time, the young master should do it himself. Feeding and bathing the creature would help them bond. Bliss, however, responded coldly that he didn't want to be friends with the keeper, though he told Shauna to hurry back. In the next moment, the heroine found herself in the spacious bathroom with the basket and the keeper inside. The creature said it disliked water that was too cold or too hot, It had to be body temperature. Shauna thought the keeper was rather picky. She placed the keeper in the water and asked if this temperature was right. The little creature squinted and gently sank onto the water's surface. It happily splashed in the warm water, which was perfect for it. However, Shauna noticed a dark aura surrounding the creature as it floated in the water. She recoiled slightly and wondered to herself what this sinister black aura could be. Perhaps magic was leaking from the keeper in large amounts. What kind of power and malice did it harbor to stain the water so? The keeper noticed her gaze and explained that it had slept underground for a very long time, and traces of nature absorbed back then were only now surfacing. Shauna blinked, realizing there was no real danger. Looking closely at the creature again, she understood that the water had only darkened due to dirt. Shauna stepped back a little, amazed at how much dirt such a tiny body could release. The keeper said now was not the time to fuss over personal matters, though Shauna thought the amount of dirt didn't exactly count as a personal thing. Slightly irritated, it told the guide to stop chattering and come closer. The creature remarked that Shauna didn't seem frightened by its current form, but when it grew, no one would be able to look at it from above. The keeper thought she might not believe him, but Shauna assured him she did. She already knew its true form, so it no longer scared her. Now nearly clean and white, the keeper explained that its original form was a snow-white dragon. Born to bring peace to the world, it would battle evil using dark powers. Shauna clapped her hands, pretending to be genuinely surprised, though she already knew about the white dragon. She named Bliss's keeper the White Dragon. Another option, white snow, didn't suit it, but white dragon fit perfectly. The keeper asked the guide if she knew why it had chosen the third son of the Huff family as its master. Shauna answered that it was because the young master harbored enormous mana potential. The keeper confirmed this. The little creature acknowledged that if the guide had noticed such a detail, it couldn't look down on her due to her youth. It then asked if she could sense mana. If so, she needed to understand the problem with her master. Shauna knew nothing about this, but not wanting to answer rudely, she thought perhaps a simple nod would suffice. The keeper explained that his master's mana was completely blocked, which greatly surprised the young guide. Shauna didn't understand. She had never heard such a thing before. Wasn't Bliss's delayed awakening caused by the incompetence of his previous guide? The keeper continued, explaining that this was exactly why he had begun speaking to her now. His master had no mana at all, and could not hear the creature's voice. The guide cautiously asked if there was any possibility that mana might eventually be released. According to her knowledge, Bliss was supposed to awaken in a few years with the appearance of the main heroine. This was how it was written in the novel, so there seemed to be no reason to worry, right? The White Dragon disagreed, warning that if things were left as they were, his master would either never awaken before death, or would do so in an abnormal way, entering a state of overflow. The current situation was extremely dangerous. The mana accumulating in Bliss's body was harming him, and soon he would not be able to contain it. This could lead to a fatal outcome. Shauna grew anxious, but managed to ask if, assuming awakening went normally, Bliss would be all right. The keeper said sadly that even with a successful awakening, the main problem would remain, and the young master would face a fatal end in the near future. The guide clutched her dress tightly, unable to believe what she had heard. Could it be that Bliss would die regardless of how events unfolded? Shauna recalled that in the novel, events began 1 or 2 years after Bliss's awakening. This meant that, although it wasn't explicitly mentioned in the book, Bliss could have died after the story ended. She thought how tragically unlucky this boy's life was. The keeper stated that to prevent his master from dying, he needed the girl's help as his guide. Shauna looked at him with wide, puppy-like eyes and asked if it was truly necessary for her to be involved. Wouldn't it be better if the white dragon helped his master instead of an inexperienced guide? The keeper refused, explaining that he could not control his own mana perfectly until he matured. If he touched his master's mana now, they could both die. Unfortunately, he could not accelerate his growth, and by the time he reached maturity, it would already be too late for his master. The keeper asked why the guide hesitated, and she replied that it wasn't hesitation. She simply didn't know what to do. The keeper insisted that Shauna only needed to perform her duties as a guide. Shauna pressed further, noting that if she continued as she had, Bliss would die at an early age. The creature observed whether the young guide had noticed that his master's body temperature was far below normal. Shauna didn't realize this fully, but Bliss's hand was undeniably cold. The young master had been born with an immense amount of mana, yet it could not circulate, becoming trapped within his body. This stagnation negatively affected both his physical and mental health. Moreover, the keeper noted, his master showed no outward emotions, suppressing everything within himself. This habit had formed as a consequence of the blocked mana. The young master himself was completely unaware of these problems and the potential consequences they could bring. Shauna pondered whether Bliss's temperament was shaped by his mana. If that were the case, then resolving the mana issue could prevent him from developing unhealthy attachments. The keeper asked the young guide what she thought would be easier, to activate the cycle of accumulated mana, or to help his master express emotions. Shauna responded that expressing emotions would be easier, and the keeper agreed. The keeper smiled innocently and said that the guide would thus help her master to manifest his emotions. Shauna was utterly surprised by this declaration and had no idea how she was supposed to do it. If the young master could skillfully express his emotions, it would become much easier for him to release the suppressed mana. The keeper asked the girl for no overly difficult task. Meanwhile, the young master sat in his room waiting for his guide to arrive. The keeper then said something entirely unexpected. He instructed her to raise the young master's body temperature in a rather unconventional way. His body temperature was below normal, so warming him would make it much easier to release tension and express emotions. The keeper noticed the sudden change in the guide's expression and asked why she looked so disturbed. Shauna recalled that the main heroine in the novel had used this exact method with Bliss. Nervously, Shauna protested that the young master was only 12 years old. The keeper calmly replied that he was already aware of that. The guide countered that she herself was 15, and nothing would come of it. But the keeper seemed unconcerned. Even in a fantasy world, Shauna refused to compromise her moral principles. She rebelled internally, determined not to perform such an act. The keeper squinted thoughtfully, advising her to wait and remain silent for a moment. The creature remarked that her outward appearance was deceptive, hiding a cunning serpent within. Shauna wondered what on earth he meant. The white dragon clarified that he was referring to warming his master while holding his hands, simultaneously controlling the mana. The keeper sighed, lamenting that pitiful humans often obey their desires blindly, regardless of age or gender. The guide asked if merely holding hands would have any effect. The keeper replied that even though it was a relatively simple method, repeated regularly, it would work. Physical condition and mana were closely linked. If blood circulation could warm him, it would be easier to activate the mana. After all, body temperature could be adjusted directly or indirectly. The keeper seemed to understand that Shauna had a talent for irritating the young master. The white dragon was not asking the girl to anger Bliss, but in order for him to show his emotions as a child, Shauna needed to provide a stable support. The keeper asked the young guide to do this for the young master, as he had no one else he could trust with such a task. Shauna frowned and listened carefully. The keeper explained that the same applied to his master. She sighed, realizing that until the main heroine appeared, she had no choice but to help the third son of the Huff family.
Suddenly, the keeper sensed his master approaching and informed the guide. The creature dove under the water, then resurfaced, blinking its dark eyes like a little puppy. Shauna stepped back, marveling at how skillfully this little creature could pretend to be adorable in front of its master. Bliss entered the bathroom and asked why the guide was taking so long. He half joked, half seriously suggesting he thought they might have both drowned. Shauna apologized and said she was coming. The keeper, now wrapped in a soft towel in Shauna's hands, addressed her. He looked at her, urging her to try warming the young master with her mana. Shauna was surprised at how quickly events were unfolding. She clearly wasn't prepared for this. Meanwhile, the young master waited, along with his keeper, for his guide to approach. Shauna tensed up, realizing she had to do this right here, right now. Her mind swirled with emotions and questions. She had no idea what to do. The guide turned to the young master and asked if he could hold the keeper. The keeper, snuggled in the warm towel, looked at his master with puppy-like eyes. Bliss glanced at the bath with its dirty water, wondering if Shauna really called this little white fluff his keeper. Nevertheless, he agreed and extended his hands toward the towel. Shauna, touching the young master's icy hands, feigned surprise and asked why his hands were so cold. She placed the keeper, still wrapped in the towel, on the vanity. Bliss was startled, realizing just how cold his hands were, and the guide confirmed it. Shauna quickly moved closer and enveloped his hands with hers. Bliss seemed slightly annoyed, asking what she was doing. She replied that she was warming his hands since hers were much warmer. Shauna focused on her magic, imagining the warmth flowing along with her mana. The young master watched curiously, observing what his guide was doing. At her touch, his hands involuntarily shivered as Shauna held his fingers firmly between hers. Shauna opened her eyes, wondering if there had actually been a reaction. Could it be that she had managed to warm his hands after all? However, Bliss pulled his hands away and turned from her, saying it wasn't necessary. The young master hurried to leave the room. Shauna grew nervous and called after him. She thought she had ruined everything with her actions, but the keeper smiled instead, assuring her that she had done well. For 2 weeks, Shauna adjusted her guiding method to the one suggested by the white dragon. She focused on warming Bliss's hands, taking on the role of a grandmother caring for her grandson. Yet the result was always the same. The young master was consistently surprised and sometimes irritated by her actions. So one day she decided to consult the white dragon. She asked whether continuing to touch Bliss, despite his dislike, might backfire. The keeper objected, explaining that if she failed, he would die. What then would Shauna do? At first, Shauna could hardly believe it and asked again if it was true that his life was in danger. While Bliss meditated, the keeper explained that the guide had to act naturally, with all her heart. Helping out of duty alone would be meaningless. The keeper reassured her not to worry, insisting that the method truly worked. Shauna, however, remained skeptical. He added that Bliss's hands were now warmer than before, and when she touched them, the back of his neck flushed. Shauna assumed it was because Bliss was annoyed. The keeper smiled and insisted that everything was fine and that she was doing well. He advised that she needed to irritate her young master even more. Shauna was utterly confused by what the white dragon meant. Every day, Shauna worried that she was inconveniencing Bliss, but now she felt positive about today's session. And that was because today's practice would take place outdoors. Shauna dressed neatly, ready for whatever awaited them. Although in the past the heroine had sworn she would never enjoy training outdoors, being a typical homebody, today was different. In this world, Shauna had no phone, no familiar television, no laptop, none of the comforts she had grown used to. In other words, boredom constantly gnawed at her, forcing her to step beyond her comfort zone in this unfamiliar place. That's why she was genuinely pleased by the white dragon's suggestion to train outside. Shauna wondered why she hadn't thought of it earlier. Of course, they wouldn't be going into the city. They would only stroll near the flugel. At the mansion's exit, her young master was already waiting, his keeper comfortably perched on his shoulder. Bliss noticed his guide carrying a basket of unknown contents in her hands. The young master asked what was in the basket, and Shauna replied that it was a snack, just in case they got hungry. Bliss snorted irritably, remarking that if anyone saw them, they might think it was a picnic. Almost at the exit, Bliss paused, not turning to his guide, as if he wanted to speak. He said that no one managed the place, which left the garden in somewhat poor condition. He continued, but then hesitated, seemingly embarrassed to go on. Shauna realized he felt ashamed of the garden's untidy appearance and reassured him that it didn't matter. She added that it was unimportant anyway. They were there for training, not for a picnic. Hearing this, the young master seemed to relax slightly, his tension easing. Once they reached the garden, Bliss described it, a collection of dry, likely dead trees, scattered weeds and grass, and neglected gazebos. Seeing the garden, Shauna feigned pleasant surprise, though internally she thought it was more than mere neglect. It was complete disarray. Noticing what seemed to be the only reasonably healthy tree, Shauna suggested they go rest in its shade. Approaching the tree, the young master suddenly shrugged off his dark coat and shook it out. Then Bliss knelt and spread the coat he had just removed onto the green grass. He turned his head to Shauna, looking at her surprised expression, and asked if something was wrong. Holding the basket in her hands, Shauna asked if her master had removed and spread his jacket so that she could sit on it. Bliss replied that a gentleman could not allow a lady to sit directly on the bare ground, but if she preferred not to sit, it was no problem. Shauna quickly declined and sat on Bliss's jacket, spread over the grass, thanking him politely. She noted how caring Bliss was, confident that in the future he would become well known among young ladies. The young master, however, objected and asked his guide not to say such strange things. Shauna chuckled quietly, thinking that Bliss was embarrassed by the compliment. Meanwhile, the keeper urged her to continue speaking. Shauna was surprised by this instruction, but the keeper insisted she keep flustering her young master. The keeper confidently squeaked that Shauna should steal the boy's adolescent heart entirely by showering him with compliments. Shauna looked at the little rascal, the keeper, bewildered, all the sparkles in his eyes reflecting off her head like tiny stars. The guide didn't want to do it at all, yet she understood perfectly that she had no choice. She continued, saying she was certain that when the young master grew up, he would meet a beautiful girl and fall in love. A man as impressive and kind as Bliss would undoubtedly steal many hearts, but the boy did not ask her to continue. He commanded her to stop. He then asked if she would be pleased if he said similar nonsense, claiming she would meet a good man and fall in love with him. Shauna saw no issue with this and replied that probably, yes. When she, like Bliss, grew up, she would meet a wonderful man and fall in love. Bliss, in turn, would meet a good girl and soon marry her, paying no attention to other ladies. Suddenly, Shauna noticed something was wrong and asked what had happened to Bliss. She observed that her young master looked far sadder than he had just a few minutes ago. Bliss asked if his guide truly thought she could leave the flugel. He explained that it was stipulated in the contract. If he could not awaken, neither could his guide leave the mansion. Perhaps the two of them, along with all the servants of this house, would remain trapped here forever, and everyone else would forget they ever existed. Bliss already suspected this, so he did not see it as something frightening. But Shauna, knowing nothing of such things, was bewildered when he spoke of unfamiliar concepts like love and marriage. Shauna was deeply shocked by these terrible ideas expressed by her young master. Could things really be so grim? She wondered why Bliss was asking her to prepare for such a dreadful end alongside him. It seemed the young master firmly believed he would never awaken. And it was sad that he held such pessimistic thoughts about his own future. Yet, the guide refused to despair or accept that they were doomed. Shauna replied firmly that Bliss would awaken, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. She asked Bliss to focus solely on his awakening and nothing else. Meanwhile, Shauna promised herself that she would definitely meet a handsome young man with striking features. The young master was surprised at how boldly and vainly the guide spoke, but Shauna interrupted him, saying it was enough chatter. Rising from the grass, her shining hair fluttered in the gentle breeze, sparkling under the sunlight. Shauna suggested they begin their training. Bliss looked at her in surprise, seemingly unable to look away from her radiant figure that seemed to emit warmth. After a while, the third son of the Huff family collapsed against the trunk of a tree, utterly exhausted, letting out a heavy sigh. Shauna praised him, saying he had done well. She brought the basket closer and lifted the towel that had been covering him. From the basket, she took a plate of cookies and offered them to her young master. Shauna suggested that Bliss rest and wipe the sweat from his brow, but he declined her offer. When he tried one of the cookies, Bliss suddenly choked and began coughing violently. It seemed something in the taste was off. Bliss asked why the cookie tasted so strange. Shauna replied that there was nothing unusual about it, and he could even eat the whole batch if he wished. She hadn't wanted the cookie to taste ordinary, so before their walk, she added a pinch of magic. She knew that in her previous world, treats like these had been extremely popular and delicious. The guide wanted to explain this to him, but the young master interrupted before she could speak. Bliss grew annoyed and asked why Shauna was doing this. Was even his guide mocking him? Shauna panicked, insisting she had no intention of mocking him. It was just a harmless joke. She asked if the texture of the cookie wasn't interesting, almost revealing that it was from another world. Shauna quickly corrected herself, saying that in a distant country she had once lived, such cookies were very popular. Bliss questioned whether people really liked cookies that melted in the mouth, and Shauna confirmed, assuring him they were indeed very tasty. Shauna took a cookie herself and tasted it, admitting that it turned out remarkably close to the one from her world. She seemed genuinely pleased with the result and decided that next time she would make the texture slightly firmer. The young master sighed heavily, clearly struggling to understand the thoughts of his guide. Suddenly, Bliss remarked that he thought Shauna was like a mutant. The girl shivered. Had she just been insulted? He continued, stating that she didn't seem to belong in this mansion at all. Bliss noticed something lying near the basket. He asked what it was, and Shauna explained that it was a wreath. She said she had made it herself and asked if it wasn't pretty. Bliss turned away and stated that he wouldn't wear it, even if his life depended on it. The guide was genuinely surprised by his reaction, realizing that he had misunderstood her intentions entirely. Could it be that Bliss assumed she had woven the wreath for him? Apparently, he drew hasty conclusions and even called Shauna a mutant simply because he thought she did strange things. Shauna, however, thought to herself that since they were at this point, why not? A mischievous sparkle appeared in her eyes. She sweetly asked Bliss to wear the wreath just this once. The boy recoiled and told her not to even try, but Shauna insisted, claiming the wreath would look perfect on him. Irritated, Bliss shouted that the wreath would suit his guide much better, but definitely not him. Shauna froze in place, completely unprepared for such a statement from the young master. Bliss himself hadn't expected to say something like that. He fell silent, his cheeks flushed with a delicate pink. Shauna wondered if it was a compliment or an insult, but she thanked him and explained that she wanted to gift the wreath to him, not keep it for herself. She praised that the color of his hair resembled the night sky, while his eyes mirrored the depths of the ocean. So, if you added the color of this land, wouldn't it form a perfect combination? Suddenly, muffled footsteps echoed, and the tip of a wooden cane pressed into the green grass. A raspy, elderly voice remarked on the interesting sight it had just witnessed. Bliss was startled, his expression changing as he turned pale upon seeing his father. Shauna glanced back and saw a tall, elderly man dressed in luxurious attire standing behind them. This was Duke Jonathan Huff, who had come to see why his son had left the wing with his guide. From his perspective, it seemed they had gone just to chatter and amuse themselves. Bliss lowered his head and began apologizing to his father. The Duke commanded him not to call him father. He refused to acknowledge someone like Bliss as his son. Once again, Bliss apologized. Watching all this, Shauna thought that Bliss hadn't objected even once. He was far too submissive. How cruel the Duke must be toward Bliss that the boy could say nothing but pitiful apologies. Shauna stepped forward to stand in front of the young master, declaring that the Duke seemed to have misunderstood everything. She explained that it had been her idea for the young master to train outside. Nature positively influences the circulation of mana, which increases the chances of awakening. For this reason, they were practicing outdoors. Bliss had exerted a great deal of effort in channeling natural mana, so they decided to take a brief break to restore his energy. Shauna continued, explaining that a noble and powerful mage like the Duke should understand that mana originates from physical strength. The Duke, unsurprised, asked if that meant the wreath was also part of the practice. He picked it up and tore it into pieces. He questioned whether the guide truly believed that wearing a crown of woven flowers on one's head could enhance the sense of mana. Had her teacher really instructed her this way? Shauna opened her mouth to argue, but was suddenly stopped as Bliss grabbed her wrist. Startled, she fell silent and turned to look at the young master. The guide observed Bliss's calm yet slightly frowning expression. Bliss stepped closer to his father, lowering his head, and admitted that he had acted foolishly. He promised it would not happen again, leaving Shauna frozen in amazement at his words. The Duke instructed his son to carefully consider his position and to no longer bring shame to the Huff name. Clenching his fists, Bliss quietly assured that he would no longer cause his father to worry. After Duke Huff departed, Shauna stood on the grass beside the basket, holding the jacket, while Bliss knelt with his familiar by his side. Breaking the silence, Shauna told the young master not to worry so much, and he abruptly agreed. Bliss muttered that all his efforts were still pointless, so there was no need to fret. He reached for his familiar, who also appeared visibly uneasy. The young master instructed Shauna to stop involving herself in this hopeless endeavor. Shauna bowed her head, closed her eyes, and frowned, clearly upset by his words. After Duke Huff forbade his son and the guide from leaving the mansion, something troubling occurred. Bliss developed a high fever, preventing him not only from leaving the wing, but even from leaving his own room. Shauna tried to calm herself, thinking that since the novel didn't mention this, the illness might not be severe. Yet another concern weighed on her, the staff of the wing. Whether in the main building or the wing, the servants avoided Duke Huff. The worst part was that they also seemed to avoid Bliss. Did the people around him even care for him? Shauna made it her mission to uncover the truth. She approached one of the maids and asked how Bliss had been feeling lately. The maid replied that his fever remained high, but there were no other major ailments. Shauna asked whether the young master was eating properly, but the maid admitted she didn't know. The guide thought to herself, so they bring him food, but have no idea whether he actually eats it. Isn't it their duty to know if he has taken his meals or medicine? Shauna asked if the maids knew whether Duke Huff had summoned a doctor for him. The maid answered that she had no knowledge of that either. She was hired solely to work in the wing and had no chance to interact with either the estate staff or the master himself. Shauna countered, insisting there must be someone who reports the young master's condition to Duke Huff, right? In that instant, the maid's expression shifted, and she looked at Shauna with clear embarrassment, as if the question had unsettled her. Observing this change, Shauna frowned, recognizing that her intuition had been correct. On the day the guide had left the mansion with Bliss, Duke Huff had appeared far too unexpectedly. Shauna requested that the maid report in detail about the young master's condition. The third son of the Huff family had been ill for an entire week, and no measures had been taken during that time. The maid scowled in annoyance, thinking this guide was far too insistent. She had been assigned to the neglected wing against her will, and now some girl was trying to instruct her as if she were the lady of the house. Although the maid's family had fallen apart, she still held the status of a baron's daughter. She saw no reason to cater to this commoner girl. Finally, she addressed the guide, saying she would, take note of her requests. However, the maid argued that the guide did not work in the wing. Everyone had their duties, and she suggested they not interfere with each other's work. Shauna replied that she knew the maid considered herself a very haughty guide with limited abilities and, on top of that, merely a commoner. She addressed the maid, whose name was Anne. Even so, they could not neglect the young master's health. Could it be that the servants truly believed that if Bliss fell ill, they bore no responsibility for him? The maid replied, no, and Shauna agreed, but the young Master Bliss was, after all, the lord of this wing. Everyone currently in the estate had been hired specifically to serve the young master. Shauna gave Anne a not at all threatening smile, as if the maid's haughty attitude didn't bother her in the slightest. After a brief silence, Shauna asked if it wasn't time to bring dinner to the young master. She suggested that Anne deliver the meal, but the maid insisted that it was her duty. Shauna responded that, judging by Anne's words, if they truly did not neglect Bliss, they certainly didn't know how to properly care for a sick person, and since the young guide had experience in such matters, she could, and genuinely wanted to help. It seemed Anne was extremely irritated and barely restrained herself from snapping. Yet Shauna thought the maid could afford to smile more. The guide walked down the corridor toward Bliss's room, pushing a cart with a tray of food. Reaching the door, she knocked and emphasized that she had brought dinner for the young master. From behind the door, after a moment of silence, came a faint and weak voice, Bliss asking her to leave the food and go. Shauna worried, but thought that although his voice was hoarse, if he could respond, the illness must be passing, right? She also realized she might have pushed Anne a little too hard. Her thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a sharp, loud crash from behind the young master's door. Without hesitation, she burst into the room, shouting, "What happened to the young master?" Entering, she saw the young master had collapsed onto the bed, seemingly powerless. His face was flushed, sweat streamed down his forehead, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Thinking seemed difficult for him in the midst of the fever. Shauna rushed to his side, dropping to her knees. She was deeply worried, for the boy's condition was clearly serious. Bliss's eyes held no sparkle. All vitality had drained from them. He barely opened them and saw Shauna kneeling beside him. In a hoarse whisper, he asked what she was doing there. Shauna apologized and said she should have come much earlier. Before his eyes, there was only a haze, yet Bliss still found Shauna's hand and squeezed it, asking why she was apologizing. Exhausted, the young master leaned against her shoulder, believing that Shauna had done nothing wrong. Shauna was surprised, her voice fading as she called to Bliss, but received no reply. It seemed he had fallen asleep. The guide heard a familiar voice in her mind, asking why she had come only now. She turned her head and noticed the small, fluffy form of the guardian resting on the bed. The guardian had expected the guide to arrive earlier, and he seemed rather disappointed. Shauna apologized, hoping that the young master had eaten well and taken his medicine on time. The white dragon replied that he had barely eaten anything. Once again, the guide looked at the young master, gripping his shoulders firmly to keep him from collapsing. He was still unconscious, yet even in this state, the fever denied him any rest. Shauna felt relieved she had come. She guessed that his temperature wouldn't drop due to a lack of energy. The guardian objected, saying Bliss's recovery was hindered by psychological issues. As Shauna noticed, her master was slowly changing thanks to their joint efforts. For a brief moment, the doors to his soul had opened, yet after the encounter with his father, he shut them once more to everyone. Now, because of this, neither his body nor his consciousness seemed willing to heal. After some time, Bliss finally managed to open his eyes, and it seemed his awareness had returned. He lay in his bed, confused about what had happened, but at least the sparkle of life had returned to his eyes. The young master noted that his body felt unusually light. Could it be that the fever had finally subsided? He sensed something strange and turned his head to the side, though it was difficult to do. To his right, he saw his guide, peacefully asleep, still touching his hand. He stared at her sleepy face, unable to believe his eyes. Was this really Shauna? Bliss wondered if his guide had been caring for him all along. After all, it was the duty of the servants, who hadn't done their job at all. Suddenly, Bliss heard a voice, seeming to penetrate his mind and echo inside his head. The young master sprang up, sitting abruptly on the bed. The guardian was quite startled, but Shauna remained peacefully asleep. The boy began nervously glancing around, asking who had just spoken. The guardian jumped in surprise at the sound. The young master wondered if he had imagined it, while the guardian quietly squeaked, letting him know he was there. Not noticing his guardian, Bliss turned his gaze to the still sleeping Shauna. He observed her gripping his hand gently, her serene face calm in slumber. Watching the guide, memories from his fevered dreams began surfacing in his mind. Lost in the haze of his fever, he had pleaded that he didn't want to go to that house, expressing fear of all the people there. Hot tears ran down his cheeks as he vowed he would do anything asked of him, needing nothing but to have someone stay by his side. Bliss reached toward the figure he saw through the fog, and it squeezed his hand. In his mind, a distant voice reassured him that it would not leave. It was the guide, promising to stay close to the young master. Shauna stroked her hand, keeping it near her. Looking at Shauna and recalling how badly he had felt before, Bliss let out a heavy sigh. His face remained pale and weak, and he admitted he was tired and utterly drained. This explained why he wanted to remain a little longer, holding the warmth of his guide's hand. Time, slow yet relentless, continued moving forward, and the seasons gradually shifted. And then came Bliss's long-awaited 13th birthday. A banquet was planned for the evening, and Shauna quietly waited in her room. Though dressed beautifully, her mood seemed less than cheerful in anticipation. Shauna saw little reason to wait for the banquet. Everyone already knew how it would unfold. A candle placed on the cake, blown out, and that would be all. Both Bliss and Michael were born in February. Despite a few days' difference, the brothers always celebrated their birthdays together. Officially, the celebration was for both, but Michael always remained the main focus of the festivities. When Bliss entered the banquet hall, the Huff family pretended not to recognize him. Guests whispered behind his back, making his walk through the hall feel more like a hasty escape than a celebration. Afterward, the boy returned to his wing and spent the rest of the day in his room. No one had greeted him, and it was better not to mention gifts at all. Shauna felt a pang of pity for Bliss. She considered throwing him a private celebration, but immediately dismissed the idea, knowing no one would want to celebrate a birthday alone with just one companion. Such an event would likely wound Bliss's heart even more. Shauna lay back on her own bed, lifting her hands to hold a box wrapped in beautiful paper. She gazed at the package, meant as a gift for Bliss, wondering if her effort would be in vain. Though she couldn't celebrate his birthday alongside him, at least she could give him a present. Not an ordinary one, but imbued with magic. The white dragon had also helped create it, since Shauna couldn't manage it alone. Suddenly, she realized how quickly time had passed. The sun was already beginning to sink below the horizon. Shauna thought she only needed to quickly deliver the gift to Bliss and then return to her own room. Quietly, she approached the young master's chambers and, without knocking, opened the door. Peeking in, she softly called to him, asking if he was inside, but all she heard was silence. Looking fully into the room, she saw nothing and no one. Noticing the emptiness, Shauna wondered if Bliss had gone to the banquet hall, but the book had said no one greeted him there, so he surely wasn't inside. The guide worried. What if the young master had found courage and had actually gone to the celebration? She had recently, albeit vaguely, sensed his mana. Besides, the white dragon had said that Bliss had undoubtedly heard and reacted to his voice. Feeling his mana now, Shauna couldn't help but feel proud of her progress. After all, Bliss was still just a 13-year-old adolescent. Excited, the guide decided to search for him in the banquet hall and confidently strode in that direction. She reached the main building, shrouded in darkness outside, while warm, bright light spilled from its windows. Walking through the corridor, Shauna hoped to avoid the Huff family's gaze. But on the other hand, she was curious to see what his family looked like. She was especially eager to see the two older brothers of the third son of the Huff family. The book had mentioned they were handsome, but not as striking as Bliss. Observing them would also give her an approximate idea of how the young master might look when he matured. Most likely, the brothers didn't know Bliss's guide, so if she observed from a distance, no trouble should arise. Shauna approached the manor doors where a guard stood. He apologized politely and asked that if she had an invitation, she should state her name. Shauna didn't have an invitation, but she decided to take a chance and speak the truth, uncertain if it would work. She said that she was the guide of the young Master Bliss, the host of today's banquet, and that her name was Shauna. The guard studied her for a moment, as if scrutinizing her appearance. After a brief pause, the man allowed her to pass. Shauna felt a rush of relief and thanked him. The massive manor doors opened before her, and she took a quick glance at the interior. Without hesitation, Shauna stepped inside, walking across the luxurious red carpet. Suddenly, a loud voice called out from behind her. It was the guard, announcing that the guide of young Master Bliss Huff had arrived. Instantly, all eyes of the guests turned toward the girl who had just entered. Shauna looked back at the guard, embarrassed by his announcement. She had not expected it. The man standing in the shadows near the door, however, seemed entirely unfazed. On the contrary, a cheeky, mischievous smile spread across his face. Shauna realized that he had done it deliberately, intending to put her in an awkward light. After a few tense moments, she finally managed to find a quiet corner. She let out a sigh of relief, glad to have escaped the intrusive gazes of the aristocrats. Shauna began scanning the room, determined to quickly find Bliss, hand him the gift, and leave. But among the numerous ladies and gentlemen, she didn't spot a familiar face. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice behind her asked sharply what she was doing there. Startled, Shauna jumped back, instinctively moving away from the stranger. A fleeting thought raced through her mind. Who is this? The stranger didn't seem pleased with such a guest and addressed her rather rudely. He was a teenager with somewhat harsh facial features and fairly long hair. He demanded to know what Bliss's guide was doing here. Judging by his rude tone, Shauna guessed that this was Bliss's older brother, Michael. She explained that she had come to meet young Master Bliss. Michael, maintaining his harsh tone, asked why she was searching for Bliss here. Before Shauna could respond, he said that someone like Bliss's guide wasn't welcome here. He added that the banquet was only for aristocrats, so neither Shauna nor Bliss could be present. The guide apologized to Michael and said she would leave the manor immediately. Suddenly, Michael's hand slammed against the wall near her face, startling Shauna. Pressing her against the wall, he demanded how she could just come to a banquet dedicated to his birthday and leave whenever she pleased, without doing anything at all. Shauna, clearly unwilling to submit to the rude boy, calmly and monotonously wished him a happy birthday. Michael, surprisingly not irritated, smiled faintly and wondered if she intended to congratulate him with mere words alone. He pointed at the box in her hands and demanded that she give the gift to him first. Only then would she be allowed to leave. Shauna, however, held the package even tighter and said the gift was for young Master Bliss. Michael objected. How could a present not be for him on his birthday? Shauna explained that it was also young Master Bliss's birthday and apologized for not preparing a gift for Michael. She suggested that, if he didn't mind, she could think about a present for him later. Michael, far from polite, snatched the package from her hands without hesitation. Smirking arrogantly, he declared that he wanted this very gift, so Shauna had no choice but to give it up. Shauna was taken aback that he could seize the box so easily. Was he really 15? His behavior seemed utterly inappropriate. She reached for the box, asking for it back, but Michael began opening it, curious about what could be inside to cause such worry for the guide. Upon seeing the contents, Michael's expression changed and he frowned. Inside were black, warm, and exquisitely crafted gloves, clearly meant for young Master Bliss. Shauna refused to back down, pleading for the gloves to be returned. Michael scoffed, claiming they seemed like cheap gloves easily found in the city, but enchanted. Michael glared at her angrily, demanding she explain what magic had been cast on the gloves. He set a condition. If the guide didn't explain, he would tear the gloves apart. In this hopeless moment, Shauna intensely wished she could strike the rude boy. She repeated that the gift was meant for young Master Bliss. She had only applied the necessary enchantment for him, which had nothing to do with Michael. Michael remarked that the guide standing before him was far bolder than Bliss himself. Yet, why did a simple guide decide she could behave so freely toward Bliss's brother? He gave an example, saying that worms stick to worms. So why was the girl behaving so audaciously toward Michael? Shauna thought it was fortunate that there were many people around, and he couldn't lay a hand on her. Smiling, Michael spoke in a threatening tone, emphasizing that the girl still continued to look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on Michael, her head held high as if fearless. Michael seemed about to grab her by the neck and say something, but a familiar voice called his name, stopping him. Slightly flustered, Michael glanced toward the voice, addressing another boy standing nearby. Henry. Henry stepped closer and emphasized that everyone was gathered for Michael's birthday, so there was no reason to cause a scene. Michael replied that it wasn't intentional, blaming the girl standing beside him. Yet Henry repeated Michael's name in an even harsher tone, silencing him. Michael explained that he was talking about the girl, Bliss's guide, as if she were mocking him. The guide seemed less than thrilled to see another Huff brother, realizing just how rude they all were. Henry introduced himself, noting it was their first meeting. He was the eldest son of the Huff family. Shauna bowed and greeted him, saying her name was Shauna. Henry asked if Michael had been causing trouble for the guide, inquiring if something had happened. Shauna frowned and lowered her gaze upon learning the boy's name, realizing she shouldn't have crossed paths with Henry. On the surface, he appeared indifferent toward Bliss, but in truth he harbored deep disrespect for his brother and ignored him entirely. After young Master Bliss's awakening, Henry struggled with a sense of inferiority, unable to mock his younger brother, which deeply wounded his pride. Consequently, he, along with Prince Fabian, decided to conspire to eliminate Bliss. If Michael was the local troublemaker, then Henry was the enforcer of the mafia, and Prince Fabian played the role of the boss. In any case, Shauna thought, there was nothing good about drawing the attention of a bad boy. She decided she needed to protect herself here. Calmly, she explained that nothing serious had happened, just a minor misunderstanding between her and Michael. Henry pondered what kind of misunderstanding it could be, and his gaze landed on the pair of gloves Michael was holding. The eldest brother instructed the younger to return the gloves as if nothing had occurred. Michael tossed the gloves roughly into Shauna's hands, frowning, and muttered that he didn't need such a thing. Finally, Henry told his brother to go see their father. Michael shot a displeased look at Shauna, then reluctantly obeyed, leaving the two alone. Henry, together with Shauna, watched as the irritated Michael walked through the crowd toward his father. Breaking the silence, Henry asked if Shauna had come to the banquet to meet Bliss, and she nodded in agreement. Now Henry hoped that Shauna had confirmed that the young master had not attended the celebration, and he asked her not to interfere further. Shauna agreed again, though she realized he was essentially telling her to stay away from the banquet. Whether out of politeness or genuine curiosity, Henry asked if the guide had already eaten. Shauna replied that she had not. The eldest brother guessed that Bliss probably hadn't eaten either, so if Shauna wished, she could take some banquet food and share it with the young master. Shauna was genuinely surprised by such generosity, thinking to herself that this person offering her food must be good-hearted, right? In her thoughts, Henry appeared like an angel, encouraging her not to hesitate and to take as much food as she wished. Gaining courage, Shauna stepped away from her interlocutor and moved closer to the festive tables. Yet, at one moment, she glanced back and noticed a peculiar gaze fixed on her. She saw Henry's face, set in a stern expression, and wondered why he looked so angry. Shauna wondered if she had agreed too quickly. Should she have refused at least once? A blush of embarrassment rose within her, yet satisfying her hunger didn't seem like such a bad idea after all. Suddenly, from somewhere in the distance, a bold laugh rang out. It seemed to come from one of the ladies attending the banquet. 3 girls were whispering among themselves, and one noticed Shauna taking a large amount of food, which struck them as amusing. They continued mocking her, clearly enjoying themselves, though one girl whispered to be quieter. Another shrugged, insisting that even if the guide heard, it didn't matter. This girl, though not a beggar herself, stooped to the level of laughing at someone seemingly stealing banquet food. The guests murmured, wondering who this girl was and whether they should summon the guards, while others stressed that she was the guide of young Master Bliss. At that moment, Shauna realized just how mischievous Henry really was. She admitted that it wasn't a kind gesture, but a mockery meant to humiliate her, and she, unaware of the plan, had agreed immediately. Could this really be why Henry had made that expression? Yet the girl's anger and embarrassment quickly shifted into a playful smile as she found the eldest brother's reaction amusing. Shauna convinced herself that, in reality, everything had been orchestrated by her, and she had guessed this trick from the start. Could it be that Henry actually believed she considered him kind merely because of the offer to take some food? She thought that Henry must be embarrassed now, his smirk having failed, and decided it was worth observing his face closely. With a mischievous grin, she suddenly turned toward the 3 guests who had been whispering and mocking her earlier. Shauna changed her expression to a sweet, innocent smile, telling herself that all she needed to do was smile that way. The guide grabbed a glass of red wine from one of the luxurious tables and gave it a subtle shake. Suddenly, the contents of the glass spilled onto the elegant gowns of the 3 girls, who screamed in shock. While the girls struggled to understand what had happened and how the wine ended up on their dresses, Shauna quietly slipped away, thinking that anyone who volunteered to mock a magician should be prepared for consequences of that magnitude. Now, through the darkness of the night once more, the girl hurried toward young Master Bliss before anyone could notice what had occurred.